Circoncellions. Good warriors because want to be martyrs. No war now, but they want to be martyrs right away. Nubian is like child, wants right away what he likes. He said something to the Nubian, who went off, hanging his head. Asking to explain further these Circoncellions, Gabagai said that the Circoncellions were the Nubians. Then he pointed out that sunset was approaching, the market was breaking up, and they had to go to the tower. In fact, the crowd was thinning. The vendors were collecting their goods in great baskets. From the various fornaces that blinked in the rock walls, some ropes were descending, and some of the people, according to their habitations, were raising their merchandise. It was all an industrious up and down, and in a short time the city was deserted. It seemed now an immense cemetery with countless tombs, but, one after the other, those doors or windows in the rock began to come alight, a sign that the inhabitants of Piendapetsim were kindling fires and lamps to prepare for the evening. Thanks to who knows what invisible holes, the smoke of those fires came from all the peaks and spurs, and the now pale sky was streaked with blackish plumes that rose and dissolved among the clouds. They walked through what little remained of Piendapetsim, and reached an open area, beyond which the mountains left no further passage visible. Half set into the mountain, the sole artificial construction of the entire city could be seen. It was a tower, or the anterior part of a stepped tower, vast at the base, and increasingly narrow as it rose, but not like a stack of pancakes, one smaller than the other superimposed to make many levels, because a spiral passageway proceeded without interruption from one plane to the next, and apparently it also penetrated the rock, encircling the construction from base to summit. The tower was entirely punctuated by great arched doorways, one next to the other, with no free space between them except the frame that separated door from door, and the construction looked like a monster with 1,000 eyes. Solomon said that this must be like the tower erected at Babel by the cruel Nembroth, to defy the holy. 1. Blessed always be his name. And this, Gabagai said in a proud tone, this is the palace of Deacon Johannes. Now you stand still and wait, because they know you arrive and have prepared solemn welcome. I now go. Where are you going? I cannot enter tower. After you is received and seen deacon, then I come back to you. I your guide in Piendapetsim, I never leave you. Watch out with eunuchs, he is young man, and he pointed to Calandrino, they like young.
Avenue, Evcharisto, Salam.
Erect on his single foot, he saluted, in a vaguely military fashion, turned, and a moment later was already far away.
30. Buandulino meets the deacon Johannes. When they were about 50 paces from the tower, they saw a procession emerging from it.
First a squad of Nubians, but more elaborately clothed than those in the market. From the waist down they were enfolded in white cloths wound tightly around their legs, covered by a little skirt that fell halfway down the thigh. They were barekested, but wore red capes, and at the neck a leather collar in which colored stones were set, not gems but pebbles from a riverbed, arranged like a bright mosaic. On their heads they wore white hoods with many bows. On their arms, wrists, and fingers they had rings and bracelets of woven string. Those in the first row were playing pipes and drums, those in the second held their enormous clubs against their shoulders, those in the third had only bows slung around their necks. Then there followed a formation of what were surely the eunuchs, in ample and soft robes, made up like women and with turbans that seemed cathedrals.
The one in the center carried a tray laden with cakes.
Finally, escorted at either side by two Nubians waving fans of peacock feathers over his head, came the man who was surely the highest dignitary of this company. His head was covered with a turban as high as two cathedrals, a play of silken bands of different colors, from his ears hung pendants of colored stone, his arms were decked with bracelets of gaudy feathers. He also wore a garment that reached his feet, and was bound at the waist by a sash of blue silk, a span wide, and on his chest hung a cross of painted wood. He was a man of some age, and the rouge on his lips and the bistre on his eyes contradicted his skin, now yellowing and flaccid, calling even more attention to a double chin that quivered at every step he took. His hands were pudgy, with long nails as sharp as blades, painted red. The procession stopped in front of the visitors, the Nubians lined up in double file, while the eunuchs of lesser rank knelt as the one carrying the tray bowed and proffered the food. Buandulino and his men, at first uncertain how to act, dismounted and accepted pieces of cake, which they chewed dutifully, bowing. At their greeting the chief eunuch finally came forward and prostrated himself on the ground, then stood and addressed them in Greek. Since the birth of our Lord Christ Jesus we have waited for your return, and if you are surely those whom we believe you to be, it pains me to know that the 12th among you, but like you first among all Christians, was driven from his path by inclement nature. While I will give orders to our guards to study the horizon ceaselessly in expectation of his arrival, I wish you a happy sojourn in Piendapetsum, he said in a white voice. I say this to you in the name of Deacon John, I, Praxias, Supreme Chief of the Court Eunuchs, Protonotary of the province, sole Vicar of the Deacon to the priest, Supreme Custodian and Logothet of the secret path. He said this as if even the Magi should be impressed by such high rank.
Give me a break, murmured Alaramo Scotchabarosi, known as Bonehead. Just listen at him. Buandulino had thought many times about how he would introduce himself to the priest, but never about how you should present yourself to a chief eunuch in the service of the priest's deacon. He decided to follow the line they had established. Sir, he said, I express to you our joy in having reached this noble, rich, and wondrous city of Piendapetsum, the most beautiful and flourishing we have seen in all our journey.
We come from afar, bearing for Prester John the greatest relic of Christianity, the cup from which Jesus drank at the Last Supper. Unfortunately, the devil, in his envy, has unleashed against us the forces of nature, causing us to lose one of our brothers along the way, the very one who was bearing the gift, along with other tokens of our esteem for priest Johannes. By which we mean, the poet added, 100 ingots of solid gold, 200 great apes, a crown of 1,000 pounds of gold with emeralds, 10 strands of inestimable pearls, 80 chests of ivory, 5 elephants, 3 tamed leopards, 30 anthropophage dogs and 30 fighting bulls, 300 elephant tusks, 1,000 panther skins, and 3,000 ebony staves. We had heard of these riches and substances unknown to us which abound in the land where the sun sets, Praxias said, his eyes gleaming, and praise heaven if before leaving this vale of tears I may see them. Can't you keep your shitty mouth shut? Boydie hissed behind the poet, punching him in the back. What if Zosimos arrives now, and they see he's in even worse shape than us? Shut up yourself, the poet snarled, his mouth twisted. We've already said the devil's at work here, and the devil will have eaten it all up. Except for the grassel. But we still need a gift, at least one gift, to show that we're not beggars, Boydie went on murmuring. What about the Baptist's head? Buandulino suggested in a whisper. We have only 5 left, the poet said, still not moving his lips, but it doesn't matter, as long as we stay in the kingdom we certainly can't pull out the other 4. Buandulino was the only one who knew that, counting the one he had taken from Abdul, there were still 6 heads. He took one from his sack and held it out to Praxias, saying that for the moment, while they awaited the ebony, the leopards, and all those other fine things, they wanted him to deliver to the deacon the only memento left on earth of him who had baptized our Lord. Praxias, deeply moved, accepted that gift, beyond price in his eyes because of the sparkling case, which he assumed was made of that precious yellow substance he had heard so much talk about. Impatient to venerate that sacred relic, and with the air of one who considers his own property any gift made to the deacon, opened it without effort, so it was Abdul's head, the seal already broken, Buandulino said to himself, took in his hand the brownish, dried up skull, product of Artsruni's skill, exclaiming in a choked voice that never in his life had he contemplated a more precious relic. Then the eunuch asked by what names he should address his venerable guests, because tradition had assigned them so many and no one now knew which ones were right. With great caution, Buandulino replied that at least until they were in the presence of the priest, they wished to be called the names by which they were known in the distant west, and he gave the real names of each of them. Praxias admired the evocative sound of names like Artsruni and Boydie, he found a loftiness in Buandulino, Calandrino, and Scoccabarosi, and he dreamed of exotic lands hearing Porcelli and Cutica named. He said that he respected their reserve, and concluded, now enter. The hour is late, and the deacon will be able to receive you only tomorrow. This evening you will be my guests, and I assure you that never will a banquet be more rich and sumptuous, and you will savor such delicacies that you will think with contempt of those that have been offered you in the lands where the sun sets. Why, they're dressed in rags the like of which would make our women torment their husbands to have something better, the poet muttered. We set out and we've undergone what we've undergone in order to see cascades of emeralds. When we wrote the priest's letter, you, Buandulino, were disgusted with topaz, and they're there with a dozen pebbles and a few strings and they think they're the richest in the world. Shut up. We'll wait and see, Buandulino murmured. Praxias led them inside the tower, and showed them into a hall without windows, illuminated by burning tripods, with a central carpet full of cups and trays of clay, and a series of cushions along the sides, on which the banqueters crouched with crossed legs. They were served by youths, surely also eunuchs, half naked and sprinkled with fragrant oils. They offered the guests some pots with aromatic mixtures, in which the eunuchs dipped their fingers, then touched their nostrils and their earlobes. After sprinkling themselves, the eunuchs languidly caressed the youths and invited them to proffer the perfumes to the guests, who bowed to the customs of these people, though the poet snarled that if one of that crew dared touch him he would knock out all his teeth with one finger. The supper proceeded in this fashion. Great dishes of bread, or, rather, those cakes of theirs, an enormous quantity of boiled greens, among which cabbages abounded, but did not smell because they were treated with various spices, cups of a very hot black sauce, which they called sork, in which all dipped the cakes, and Porcelli, who was the first to try it, began to cough as if flames were darting from his nose, so then the rest of the band confined themselves to moderate tasting, and then they passed the night burning with an unslakable thirst, a freshwater fish, dry and skinny, that they called thinceretta, think of that. The friends murmured, breaded with a kind of semolina and literally drowned in a boiling oil that must have been already employed for many meals, a linseed soup, which they called Moroccan, which, according to the poet, smacked of shit, wherein some shreds of fowl were floating, but so badly cooked that they seemed leather, and Praxias said with pride that it was Methagallinarios. Well, well, said the friends, with more nudging, a relish they called Sanfelic, made of candied fruit but with more pepper than fruit. At each new course the eunuchs helped themselves greedily, and as they chewed they made noises with their lips, to express their pleasure, and they motioned to the guests, as if to say, "You like it? Isn't it a gift from heaven?" They ate, taking the food with their hands, even the soup, sipping it from their cupped palms, mixing different things in one handful and stuffing it all into their mouths with one shove. But only with the right hand, because the left was placed on the shoulder of the youth who was alert always to provide more food. They removed it only to drink, seizing some jugs which they held high above their heads, pouring the water into their mouths like a fountain. Only at the end of this princely meal did Praxias give a sign, and some Nubians arrived to pour a white liquid into some minuscule goblets. The poet drained his with one gulp and immediately turned red, emitted a kind of roar, and fell as if dead, until one of the youths sprinkled some water on his face. Praxias explained that in their land the wine tree did not grow, and the only alcoholic beverage they could produce came from the fermentation of the burka berry, very common in those parts. But the strength of that drink was such that it could be tasted only in tiny sips or by barely inserting the tongue into the goblet. A real pity that they did not have here that wine so often mentioned in the Gospels, because the priests of Piendepetsim, every time they said Mass, plunged into the most unsuitable drunkenness and had trouble reaching the id miss est. When it comes to that, what else were we to expect from these monsters? Praxias said with a sigh, moving off to a corner with Buandulino, while, with titters of curiosity, the other eunuchs examined the iron weapons of the travelers. Monsters? Buandulino asked, with feigned ingenuousness. I had the impression that here no one noticed the amazing deformities of the others. You must have been listening to one of those, Praxias said with a scornful smile. They have lived here together for centuries, they have grown accustomed to one another, and refusing to see the monstrosity of their neighbors, they ignore their own. Monsters, yes, more like animals than men, and capable of reproducing faster than rabbits. This is the people that we must govern, and mercilessly, to prevent them from exterminating one another reciprocally, each race beclouded by its own heresy. This is why, centuries ago, the priest had them live here, at the confine of the kingdom, so their odious sight would not trouble his subjects, who are, as I assure you, Lord Buandulino, men of great beauty. But it is natural for nature also to generate monsters, and it is indeed inexplicable why the entire human race has not become monstrous, since it committed the most horrendous crime of all, crucifying God the Father. Buandulino was coming to realize that even the eunuchs thought wrong, and he asked his host some questions. Some of these monsters, Praxias said, believe that the Son was only adopted by the Father, others wearily debate who precedes whom, and each, monster that he is drawn into his monstrous error, multiplying the hypostasis of the divinity, believing that the supreme good is 3 different substances or even 4. What pagans! There is a single divine substance that is manifested in the course of human vicissitudes through various means or persons. The only divine substance in that it generates is the Father, in that it is generated it is the Son, in that it sanctifies it is the Spirit, but it is always the same divine nature, the rest is like a mask behind which God hides. One substance and one triple person and not, as some heretics affirm, three persons in one substance. But if this is so, and if God, all entire, mind you, and not delegating some adoptive offspring, was made flesh, then it is the Father himself who suffered on the cross. Crucify the Father. Do you understand? Only an accursed race could arrive at such an outrage, and the duty of the faithful believer is to avenge the Father. No mercy for the accursed breed of Adam. Since the beginning of the story of the journey, Nikitas had listened in silence without interrupting Buandulino further. But now he did, because he realized that his interlocutor was uncertain how to interpret what he himself was saying. Do you think, he asked, that the eunuchs hated the human race because it had made the Father suffer, or that they had embraced that heresy because they hated the human race? That's what I asked myself, that evening and afterwards, never finding an answer. I know how eunuchs think. I encountered many at the imperial palace. They try to amass power to escape their fury towards all those capable of reproducing. But often, in my long experience, I sense that also many who are not eunuchs use their power to express what they would otherwise be unable to do. Perhaps commanding is a more overwhelming passion than making love. There were other things that left me puzzled. Listen. The eunuchs of Piendapetsum constituted a caste that reproduced itself by election, and as much as their nature did not allow other ways. Praxias said that generation after generation the elders chose comely youths and reduced them to their own state, first making them servants and then heirs. Where did they find those youths, so lissom and well-made, when the entire province of Piendapetsum was inhabited only by freaks of nature? Surely the eunuchs came from a foreign country. It happens in many armies and public administrations. Those who hold power must not belong to the community they govern, so as not to feel tenderness or complicity towards the subjects. Perhaps this is what the priest wanted, to maintain in subjection that deformed and unruly people. To be able to send them to die without remorse. Because from the words of Praxias I sensed two other things. Piendapetsum was the last outpost before the beginning of the priest's kingdom. After it, there was only a chasm between the mountains that led to another territory, and on the cliffs that dominated the pass the Nubian guards were stationed, ready to provoke landslides of boulders on any who ventured into that narrow gorge. At the other end of the pass a swamp began, endless, a swamp so insidious that whoever tried to cross it was sucked under the muddy terrain or sand in perpetual movement, and after he sank up to his calves, he could no longer extricate himself, and then he vanished completely like someone drowned in the sea. In the swamp there was only one safe path, which permitted crossing, but it was known only to the eunuchs, who had been trained to recognize it by certain signs. Thus Piendapetsum was the gate, the defense, the access that had to be breached if one were to enter the kingdom. Since you were their first visitors in God knows how many centuries, that defense didn't represent a heavy task. On the contrary. Praxias was very vague about this question, as if the very name of those who threatened them was covered by some veto, but once, in an aside, he decided to tell me that the whole province lived under the threat of a warrior people, the White Huns, who could at any moment attempt an invasion. If they were to arrive at the gates of Piendapetsum, the eunuchs would send sciapods, blemier, and all the other monsters to be slaughtered to arrest the conquest for a bit, then they would have to lead the deacon to the pass, send down from the peaks enough boulders to block every passage, and withdraw into the kingdom. If they failed and were captured, and because the White Huns might force one of them, under torture, to reveal the only true path to the land of the priest, they had all been trained so that, before falling prisoner, they would kill themselves with a poison each kept in a little bag hanging around his neck, under his tunic. The horrible thing is that Praxias was sure that they would be saved in any case, because at the last moment they would have the Nubians as a shield. It is fortunate, Praxias said, to have some Circoncellians as bodyguards. I have heard mention of them, but referring to a time many centuries ago on the coasts of Africa. There were heretics down there then known as Donatists, who believed that the church should be a society of saints, but that sadly all its ministers were by now corrupt. Therefore, according to them, no priest could administer the sacraments, and they were constantly at war with all the other Christians. The most determined of the Donatists were, in fact, the Circoncellians, a barbarian people of the Moorish race, who roamed through fields and valleys in search of martyrdom, flung themselves down from cliffs on wayfarers with shouts of Deo laudes, threatening them with their clubs, ordering them to kill them, so that they could experience the glory of sacrifice. And as the others took fright and refused to do it, the Circoncellians first robbed them of all their possessions, then bashed their heads in. But I thought those fanatics were extinct. Obviously the Nubians of Piandipetsum were the descendants of those people. They would be, Praxias told me with his usual contempt for his subjects, invaluable in warfare, because they would gladly allow themselves to be killed by the enemy, and during the time it would take to fell them all, the eunuchs would be able to block the pass. But for too many centuries the Circoncellians had been awaiting this event. No one had arrived to invade the province, and they were champing at the bit, unprepared for living in peace. Because they couldn't attack and rob the monsters they were ordered to protect, they vented their impatience by hunting and fighting barehanded the wild animals. Sometimes they ventured beyond the Sambadian, in the rocky wastes where chimeras and manticores were waiting, and some of the Nubians had had the joy of meeting the same end as Abdul.
But that didn't suffice. On occasion the more convinced among them went mad.
Praxias had already learned that one of them, that afternoon, had begged us to decapitate him. Others, while they were on guard at the pass, flung themselves from the peaks, and, in short, it was hard to restrain them. Only the eunuchs could keep them in a state of vigil, warning them daily of imminent danger, persuading them that the white Huns were really at the gates, and so the Nubians often roamed the plains, narrowing their eyes, leaping with joy at every cloud of dust they could glimpse in the distance. They awaited the arrival of the invaders, in a hope that had been consuming them for centuries, generation after generation. Meanwhile, since not all were truly prepared for the sacrifice, but announced in loud voices their yearning for martyrdom in order to be well fed and well clad, they had to be kept content with delicacies and quantities of birk. I understood how the resentment of the eunuchs increased from day to day, forced to govern monsters they hate, and having to entrust their lives to fanatical gluttons perennially drunk. It was late, and Praxias had had the Nubian guard accompany them to their quarters, opposite the tower, in a stone hive of modest size, though its interior provided space for them all. They climbed those airy ladders and, exhausted by that singular day, they slept until morning. They were wakened by Gavagai, prepared to serve them. He had been informed by the Nubians that the deacon was ready to receive his guests. They returned to the tower, and Praxias personally led them up the broad outside steps, to the last floor. There they stepped through a door and found themselves in a circular corridor from which many other doors opened, one beside the other, like a set of teeth.
I realized only later how that floor had been conceived, Master Nikitas. It is hard for me to describe it, but I will try. Imagine that this circular corridor is the perimeter of a circle in whose center there is a hall, also circular. Every door that opens into the corridor leads into a passage, and each passage should be a radius of the circle, leading to the central room. But if the corridors were straight, anyone from the outer circular corridor could see what happens in the central hall, and anyone in the central hall could see someone arriving along a passage. On the contrary, however, each passage began in a straight line, but at the end it bent, making a curve, and then led into the central hall.
So no one from the outer corridor could glimpse the hall, guaranteeing the privacy of the one inhabiting it.
But the inhabitant of the hall could not see anyone arriving, either, except at the last moment. True, and this detail struck me immediately.
You understand. The deacon, master of the province, was shielded from any intruder, but at the same time he could be surprised without advance warning by a visit of his eunuchs. He was a prisoner who could not be spied upon by his guardians, but could not spy upon them either. Those eunuchs of yours were more clever than ours. But now, tell me about the deacon. They entered. The great circular hall was empty, except for some cupboards around the throne. The throne was in the center. It was of dark wood, surmounted by a baldachin. On the throne sat a human form, wrapped in a dark garment, his head covered by a turban, with a veil that fell over his face. His feet were shod in dark slippers, and dark also were the gloves that covered his hands, so nothing could be seen of the seated figure's features. At either side of the throne, crouching next to the deacon, were two other veiled forms. One of them from time to time handed the deacon a vase in which perfumes were burning, so that he could inhale the fumes. The deacon tried to reject this, but Praxias made a sign to him, imploring, commanding him to accept, and hence it must have been some kind of medicine. Stop at 5 paces from the throne, bow, and before offering your greeting, wait for his invitation, Praxias whispered. Why is he veiled? Buandulino asked. That is not asked. It is thus because it pleases him thus. They did as they had been told. The deacon raised a hand and said, in Greek, From my boyhood I have been prepared for the day of your coming. My Logothet has already told me everything, and I will be happy to assist you and to have you as my guests while you await your august companion. I have also received your incomparable gift. It is not merited, all the more so in that it comes to me from donors themselves so worthy of veneration. His voice was unsteady, that of someone in pain, but the sound was youthful. Buandulino was profuse in greetings so reverent that no one could later have accused him of having boasted of the dignity that was being attributed to him. But the deacon observed that such humility was the obvious sign of their holiness, and so there was nothing to be done.
Then he invited them to be seated on a circle of 11 cushions that he had prepared at 5 paces from the throne. He had them served with birk along with some sweet cakes that had a stale taste, and he said he was eager to learn from them, who had visited the fabled West, if truly there existed in that land all the wonders of which he had read in so many books that had passed through his hands.
He asked if there were truly a country known as Enetria, where the tree grew which drips the beverage that Jesus had transformed into his own blood. If in that land the bread was not pressed flat, half a finger thick, but swelled miraculously every morning at the cock's crow, in the form of a fruit, soft and light beneath a golden crust.
If it was true that churches there were to be seen built free of the cliffs, if the palace of the great priest of Rome had ceilings and beams of perfumed wood from the legendary island of Cyprus.
If this palace had doors of blue stone mixed with the horns of the cerastes, which prevented anyone entering from bringing poison inside, and windows of a stone that allowed the passing of light. If in that same city there was a great circular construction where now Christians ate lions, and on its vault appeared 2 perfect imitations of the sun and the moon, as large as they really are, which followed their celestial arc, amid birds made by human hands that sang the sweetest of melodies.
If beneath the floor, also of transparent stone, porphyry fish swam freely.
If it was true that this construction was reached by a stairway where, at the base of a certain step, there was an aperture from which one could watch all the things that took place in the universe as they were occurring, all the monsters of the depths of the sea, dawn and evening, the multitudes that live in Ultima Thule, a cobweb of moon-colored threads at the center of a black pyramid, flakes of a substance white and cold that fall from the sky on Africa Parista in the month of August, all the deserts of this universe, every letter of every page of every book, sunsets the rose color above the Sambidian, the tabernacle of the world set between 2 shining slabs that reproduce it to infinity, expanses of water, like lakes without shores, tempests, all the ants that exist on earth, a sphere that reproduces the movement of the stars, the secret throb of. If it was true that this construction was reached by a stairway where, at the base of a certain step, there was an aperture from which one could watch all the things that took place in the universe as they were occurring, all the monsters of the depths of the sea, dawn and evening, the multitudes that live in Ultima Thule, a cobweb of moon-colored threads at the center of a black pyramid, flakes of a substance white and cold that fall from the sky on Africa Parista in the month of August, all the deserts of this universe, every letter of every page of every book, sunsets the rose color above the Sambidian, the tabernacle of the world set between 2 shining slabs that reproduce it to infinity, expanses of water, like lakes without shores, tempests, all the ants that exist on earth, a sphere that reproduces the movement of the stars, the secret throb of one's own heart and viscera, and the face of each of us when we will be transfigured by death. They that live in Ultima Thule, a cobweb of moon-colored threads at the center of a black pyramid, flakes of a substance white and cold that fall from the sky on Africa Parista in the month of August, all the deserts of this universe, every letter of every page of every book, sunsets the rose color above the Sambidian, the tabernacle of the world set between 2 shining slabs that reproduce it to infinity, expanses of water, like lakes without shores, tempests, all the ants that exist on earth, a sphere that reproduces the movement of the stars, the secret throb of one's own heart and viscera, and the face of each of us when we will be transfigured by death. Who's been telling these people such whoppers? The poet, shocked, asked himself. While Buandulino was trying to reply prudently, saying that the wonders of the distant Occident were certainly numerous, even if surely their fame, which passes valleys and mountains enlarging them, loves to amplify and surely he could bear witness that he had never seen, there where the sun sets, Christians who ate lions. The poet snickered, whispering, at least, not on fast days. They realized that their mere presence had kindled the imagination of that young prince perennially shut up in his circular prison and that, if you live there where the sun rises, you cannot help but dream of the marvels of the sunset country especially, the poet went on murmuring, luckily in Teutonic, if you live in a shit-ass place like Piendapetsim. Then the deacon understood that his guests also wanted to know some things and he remarked that perhaps, after so many years of absence, they did not remember how to return to the kingdom from which, according to tradition, they came, also because over the centuries a series of earthquakes, and other transformations of that land of theirs had profoundly altered mountains and plains.
He explained how difficult it was to proceed through the pass and cross the swamp, He warned them that the rainy season was beginning, and it was not wise to set off on their journey at once.
Furthermore, my eunuchs, he said, will have to send messengers to my father, to tell him of your visit, and they must then return with his consent to your journey. The road is long, and all this will take a year or even more. In the meantime, you must await the arrival of your brother. I may tell you that here you will be given lodging worthy of your rank. He said this in an almost mechanical voice, as if he were reciting a lesson just learned. The guests asked him what was the function and the fate of a Deacon John, and he explained that, perhaps in their day things did not yet proceed thus, for the laws of the kingdom had been in fact modified after the departure of the Magi. It should not be thought that the priest was a single person who had continued to reign for millennia, it was a high position.
At the death of each priest, his deacon ascended the throne.
Then, immediately, dignitaries of the kingdom went out to visit all the families, and they identified, by certain miraculous signs, a boy child not yet 3 months of age, who became the future heir and putative son of the priest. The child was joyfully given up by his family and was immediately sent to buandulino, where he spent his childhood and youth being prepared to succeed his adoptive father, to fear him, honor him, and love him. The young man spoke with a sad voice because, he said, it is fated that a deacon cannot remember his carnal father, nor see his putative one, not even on his catafalque, because from the moment of his death to the moment when the heir reached the capital of the kingdom, as he had said, a year went by, at least. I will see only, and I hope this occurs as late as possible, the effigy, he said, imprinted on his winding sheet, in which he will be wrapped before the funeral, the body having been covered with oils and other miraculous substances that print the forms on the linen. Then he said, you must stay here for a long time, and I ask that you come and visit me every now and then. I love hearing tales of the wonders of the Occident. Even stories of the 1,000 battles and sieges that, it is said, make life there worthy of being lived. I see weapons at your sides far more beautiful and powerful than those used here, and I imagine that you have led armies in battle, as befits a king, while in our country we have been preparing for war since time immemorial, but I have never had the pleasure of commanding an army in the open field. He was not inviting, he was almost beseeching, and in the tone of a young man whose mind has been fired by books of wondrous adventures. Provided you do not fatigue yourself excessively, sire, said Praxias with great reverence. Now it is late and you are tired, it would be best to dismiss your visitors. The deacon nodded, but from the gesture of resignation that accompanied his farewell, Buandulino and his friends realized who really commanded in this place. 31. Buandulino waits to leave for the kingdom of Prester John. Buandulino had been talking too long, and Nikitas was hungry. Theophylactus made him sit down to supper, offering him caviar of various fish, followed by a soup with onions and olive oil, served on a plate full of bread crumbs, then a sauce of minced shellfish, seasoned with wine, oil, garlic, cinnamon, oregano, and mustard.
Not much, considering his tastes, but Nikitas did himself proud.
While the women, who had eaten by themselves, prepared to sleep, Nikitas resumed questioning Buandulino, eager to learn if he had finally arrived at the kingdom of the priest. You want to rush me, Master Nikitas, but at buandulino we remained 2 long years, and at first time passed slowly, unchanging. No news of Zosimos, and Praxias reminded us that if the 12th of our group did not arrive, without the announced gift for the priest, it was pointless for us to set out on our journey. Besides, every week brought us further, disheartening news. The rainy season had lasted longer than predicted and the swamp had become more than ever impassable. There was no word of the envoys sent to the priest, perhaps they were unable to find again the only path. Then the good season came and there was talk that the White Huns were arriving, a Nubian had sighted them to the north, and no men could be spared to accompany us on such a difficult journey, and so on and on. Not knowing what to do, we learned, little by little, to express ourselves in the various languages of that country. By now we knew that if a pygmy cried "Eu hekina degil," he meant that he was happy, and the greeting to exchange with him was "Lumus kelman peso desmar lon emposo," which means that you pledged not to make war against him and his people, and that if a giant replied to a question with bodkum it meant that he didn't know, that the Nubians called a horse neck perhaps in imitation of Nikrafar, which was camel, while the Blemier for horse said hoam hmm, and this was the only time we heard sounds uttered that were not vowels, a sign that. Not knowing what to do, we learned, little by little, to express ourselves in the various languages of that country. By now we knew that if a pygmy cried "Eu hekina degil," he meant that he was happy, and the greeting to exchange with him was "Lumus kelman peso desmar lon emposo," which means that you pledged not to make war against him and his people, and that if a giant replied to a question with Bodkum it meant that he didn't know, that the Nubians called a horse neck perhaps in imitation of Nekrafar, which was camel, while the Blemier for horse said Hoam HMM, and this was the only time we heard sounds uttered that were not vowels, a sign that they were inventing a never-used term for an animal they had never seen. The Skiapods prayed saying Hi Koba, which for them meant Pater Noster, and they called fire Deba, rainbow Deta, and dog Zeta. Try. By now we knew that if a pygmy cried U Hekina Degil, he meant that he was happy, and the greeting to exchange with him was Lumus Kelman Peso Desmar Lon Emposo, which means that you pledged not to make war against him and his people, and that if a giant replied to a question with Bodkum it meant that he didn't know, that the Nubians called a horse neck perhaps in imitation of Nekrafar, which was camel, while the Blemier for horse said Hoam HMM, and this was the only time we heard sounds uttered that were not vowels, a sign that they were inventing a never-used term for an animal they had never seen. The Skiapods prayed saying Hi Koba, which for them meant Pater Noster, and they called fire Deba, rainbow Deta, and dog Zeta. The eunuchs, during their mass, praised God singing, Condenbas ospamerostas, Comediumas carpanemphas, Capsinumas camerostas parasimbus rostam prostamas. We were becoming inhabitants of Piendapetsem, so much so that the Blemier or the Ponosians didn't seem all that different from us. We had been transformed into a band of idlers, Boron and Ardsruni spent their days debating the vacuum, and in fact Ardsruni had persuaded Gavagai to put him in touch with a Pon's carpenter, and was contriving with him to see if it was possible to construct only from wood, without any metal, one of his miraculous pumps. When Ardsruni was devoting himself to his mad venture, Boron went off with Kayat, riding into the plains and daydreaming of the Grassel as they kept their eyes alert to see if the ghost of Zosimos might appear on the horizon. Perhaps, Boydie suggested, he had taken a different route, had encountered the White Huns, God knows what he had told them, those probable idolaters, and he was convincing them to attack the kingdom. Porcelli, Cutica, and Aleramo Scacabarosi known as Bonehead, who had taken part in the founding of Alessandria and thus gained some knowledge of construction, had got it into their heads to convince the inhabitants of the province that 4 well-built walls were better than their pigeon roosts, and they had found some giants whose trade was scooping out those holes in the cliff, but were willing to learn how to mix concrete mortar or shape bricks of clay and put them in the sun to dry. At the edges of the city 5 or 6 hovels had risen, but one fine morning the friends saw them occupied by the men without tongues, vagabonds by vocation, and professional spongers. The locals tried to oust them by throwing rocks, but they were tough. Boydie, every evening, looked towards the pass, to see if good weather had returned. In other words, each of us had invented his own way of killing time, we had become accustomed to that disgusting food, and, worst of all, we could no longer do without Burke. We were consoled by the fact that the kingdom was only a stone's throw away, that is, a year's march if all went well, but we no longer were obliged to discover anything, nor to find any road, we had only to wait until the eunuchs led us along the right one. We were, so to speak, blissfully enervated, and happily bored. Each of us, except for Calandrino, was by now along in years. I was past 50, at that age people die if they haven't already died years before. We thanked the Lord, and obviously that air was good for us, because we all seemed rejuvenated. Apparently I looked 10 years younger than when I had arrived. Our bodies were vigorous and our spirits were lax, if I may put it that way. We had become so identified with the people of Piendapetsem that we had even begun to participate passionately in their theological debates. Whose side were you on? Actually, it all began because the poet's blood was hot. He couldn't go on without a woman, though even poor Calandrino could remain chaste, but then he was an angel from heaven, like his poor sister.
Our eyes had really become accustomed to that place, I realized, when the poet began to rave about a Pinocchian beauty.
He was attracted by those flapping ears, he was aroused by the whiteness of her skin, he found her supple, with well-shaped lips. He had seen 2 Ponosians coupling in a field and had sensed that the experience must have been delightful. Each enfolded the other with the ears and they copulated as if they were inside a shell, or as if they were the minced meat wrapped in vine leaves that we had savored in Armenia.
It must be splendid, he said.
Then, receiving a shy reaction from the Ponosian he had tried to approach, he took a fancy to a Blemi female. He found that, apart from the lack of a head, she had a slender waist, an inviting vagina, and furthermore it would be great to kiss a woman on the mouth as if he were kissing her womb. So he tried to associate with those people. One evening he took us to a meeting of theirs. The Blemier, like all the monsters of the province, would never have admitted any of the other races to their discussions of sacred matters, but we were different. They didn't think that we thought wrong. Indeed each race was convinced that we thought the same as they did. The only one who would have liked to show his dismay at this familiarity of ours with the Blemier was Gabagai, but by now this faithful skiapod adored us, and whatever we did could only be right. A bit out of naivete and a bit out of love, he had convinced himself that we went to the Blemier rites to teach them that Jesus was the adoptive Son of God. The Blemier church was at ground level, a single facade with 2 columns and a tympanum, and the rest went deep into the cliff. Their priest summoned the faithful by striking a hammer against a slab of stone enveloped in ropes, which gave off the sound of a cracked bell. Inside, only the altar could be seen, illuminated by lamps that, judging from the smell, burned not oil but butter, perhaps made from goat's milk. There were no crucifixes, or any other images, because, as the Blemmie acting as guide explained, they, the only ones who thought right, considered that the Word had not been made flesh, so they could not worship the image of an image. Nor, for the same reasons, could they take seriously the Eucharist, and therefore theirs was a Mass without any kind of consecration. They couldn't even read the Gospel, because it was a tale of deceit. Buandulino asked at this point what sort of Mass they could celebrate, and the guide said that, in fact, they gathered to pray, then they discussed together the great mystery of the false incarnation, which they had not yet managed to comprehend fully. And, indeed, after the Blemier had knelt down and devoted half an hour to their strange vocalizing, the priest began what he called the sacred conversation. One of the faithful rose, to remind all that perhaps the Jesus of the Passion was not an outright ghost, in which case he would have been teasing the apostles, but rather a superior power emanated by the Father, an eon who had entered the body of an ordinary, existing carpenter of Galilee. Another pointed out that perhaps, as others had suggested, Mary had actually given birth to a human being, but the Son, who could not be made flesh, had passed through her like water through a pipe, or perhaps had entered her through an ear. Then a chorus of protests arose, with many shouting, Paulician. Bogomil, meaning that the speaker had uttered a heretical doctrine, and indeed he was driven from the temple. A third ventured to say that he who had suffered on the cross was the Cyrenian, who had replaced Jesus at the last moment, but the others indicated that, in order to replace someone, that particular someone had truly to be there. No, the first worshipper rebutted, the someone who was replaced was in fact Jesus's ghost, whose ghost could not have suffered, and without the Passion there would be no redemption. Another chorus of protests, because he was thus declaring that mankind had been redeemed by that wretched Cyrenian. A fourth reminded them that the Word had descended into the body of Christ in the form of a dove at the moment of the baptism in the Jordan, but surely in such a way that the Word was confused with the Holy Spirit, and that possessed body was not a ghost. So why would the Blemier be, and rightly, fantasists? Caught up in the debate, the poet asked, but if the Son, not incarnated, was only a ghost, then why in the Garden of Olives does he utter words of desperation and moan on the cross? What would a divine ghost care if they drove nails into a body that is pure apparition? Was he only putting on an act, like a mummer? He said this, thinking to seduce, displaying acumen and desire for knowledge, the Blemmie female he had his eye on, but he achieved the opposite effect. The whole assembly started shouting, Anathema! Anathema, and our friends realized this was the moment to leave that Sanhedrin. And so it was that the poet, through an excess of theological refinement, was unable to satisfy his coarse carnal passion. While Buandulino and the other Christians devoted themselves to these experiences, Solomon was questioning the inhabitants of Piendapetsum one by one, to learn something about the lost tribes. Gabagai's mention of rabbis, the first day, told him he was on the right track. But, whether because the monsters of the various races really knew nothing or because the subject was taboo, Solomon got nowhere. Finally one of the eunuchs told him that, true, tradition had it that through the kingdom of Prester John some communities of Jews had passed, and this many centuries ago, and they had then decided to resume their traveling, perhaps fearing the threatened invasion of the White Huns would oblige them to face a new diaspora, and God only knows where they had gone. Solomon decided that the eunuch was lying, and he continued to await the moment when he and his friends would enter the kingdom, where he would surely find his coreligionists. Sometimes Gabagai tried to convert them to right thinking. The Father is the most perfect and the most distant from us that can exist in the universe, no.
And therefore how could he have generated a son?
Men generate sons in order to prolong themselves through offspring and to live in them also in the time they themselves will never see because they will have been gathered by death. But a God who has to generate a son would not be perfect from the beginning of centuries. And if the Son had existed from the beginning together with the Father, being of his same divine substance or nature, whatever you may call it, here Gabagai became confused, using Greek terms like ousia, hypostasis, physis, and hyposopon, which not even Bottolino managed to decipher. We would have the incredible case of a God, by definition not generated, who has been generated from the beginning of time. Therefore the Word, which the Father generates because he must concern himself with the redemption of the human race, is not of the same substance as the Father, is generated later, surely before the world, and is superior to every other creature, but just as surely inferior to the Father. Christ is not the power of God, Gabagai insisted, and is certainly not a commonplace power like the locust. He is, rather, a great power, but is the primogenitory and not the ingenitory. So, for you, Bottolino asked him, the Son was only adopted by God and is not then God. No, but is very holy all the same, as deacon is very holy and is adoptive son of priest. If it functions with priest, why not with God? I knows that poet asking Blemier why, if Jesus is ghost, he afraid in Garden of Olives and weeps on cross. Blemier, who think wrong, can't answer. Jesus not ghost.
Jesus adoptive son, and adoptive son not know everything like his father.
You understand. Son not homoousios, same substance as father, but instead homoousios, similar but not same substance. We not heretics like Anomoians, they believe word not even similar to father, all different. But luckily in Piendapedzim no Anomoians. They think most wrong of all. Since Bottolino, in repeating this story, also said that they continued to ask what difference there was between homoousios and homoousios, and if the Lord God could be reduced to two little words, Nikitas smiled and said, there's a difference, yes, a difference. Perhaps in the Occident you people have forgotten these diatribes, but in the Roman Empire they raged for a long time, and there were people who were excommunicated, banished, or even killed, for such nuances. What amazes me is that these arguments, which in our land were repressed long ago, survive still in that land you are telling me about. And then he thought, I always suspect this Bottolino is telling me tall tales, but a semi-barbarian like him, having lived among Alamans and Milanese, who can barely distinguish the most holy from Charlemagne, could not know these things if he hadn't heard them down there. Or did he perhaps hear them elsewhere? From time to time our friends were invited to the disgusting suppers of Praxias. Towards the end of one of those banquets, under the influence of Burke, they must have said things highly unsuitable for Magi, and, for that matter, Praxias by now had become confidential. So one night, when he was drunk and they were too, he said, Gentlemen, most welcome guests, I have reflected at length on every word you have said since your arrival here, and I realize that you have never declared that you are the Magi we have been awaiting. I continue to believe that you are, but if by chance, and I say by chance, you are not, it would not be your fault that everyone believes you are.
In any event, allow me to speak to you as a brother.
You have seen what a sink of heresies Piendapedzim is, and how difficult it is to keep this monstrous rabble under control, with terror of the White Huns on the one hand, and on the other by making ourselves the interpreters of the will and the word of that Prester John whom they have never seen. You will have realized the purpose of our young deacon on your own. If we eunuchs can count on the support and the authority of the Magi, our power increases. It is increased and fortified here, but it can extend also elsewhere. Into the kingdom of the priest. The poet asked. If you were to arrive there, you should be recognized as legitimate lords. To arrive there, you need us. We need you here. We are a strange breed, not like the monsters here who reproduce according to the wretched laws of the flesh. We become a eunuch because the other eunuchs have chosen us and made us so. In what many consider a misfortune, we all feel united in a soul family. I say we, including all the eunuchs who govern elsewhere, and we know that there are some who are very powerful also in the remote Occident, not to mention many other kingdoms in India and Africa. It would suffice if, from a very powerful center, we could be bound in a secret alliance with our brethren all over the earth, and we would have established the most vast of all empires. An empire that no one could conquer or destroy, because it would not be made of armies and territories, but of a network of reciprocal understanding. You would be the symbol and the guarantee of our power. Seeing Bottolino the next day, Praxias confided that he had the impression that, the previous night, he had said bad and absurd things, things he had never thought. He apologized, begging Bottolino to forget those words. He left him, saying, "Please, remember to forget them." Priest or no priest, the poet remarked that same day, Praxias is offering us a kingdom. You're crazy, Bottolino replied, we have a mission, and we swore an oath before Frederick. Frederick is dead, the poet replied sharply. With the eunuch's permission, Bottolino went often to visit the deacon. They had become friends.
Bottolino told him of the destruction of Milan, the foundation of Alessandria, of how walls are scaled or what is needed to set fire to the besiegers' mangonels and rams.
At these tales Bottolino would have said that the young deacon's eyes were shining, even though his face remained veiled. Then Bottolino asked the deacon about the theological controversies rampant in his province, and it seemed that, in answering him, the deacon had a melancholy smile. The kingdom of the priest, he said, is very ancient, and it has been the refuge over the centuries for all the sects excluded from the Christian world of the Occident, and it was clear that for him even Byzantium, of which he knew little, was extreme Occident. The priest was unwilling to take from any of these exiles their own faith, and the preaching of many of them has seduced the various races that inhabit the kingdom. But then, what does it matter to know what the Most Holy Trinity really is? It is enough that these people follow the precepts of the gospel, and they will not go to hell just because they think that the Spirit proceeds only from the Father. These are good people, as you will have realized, and it pains me to know that one day perhaps they must all perish, defending us against the White Huns. You see, as long as my father lives, I will govern a kingdom of the moribund. But perhaps I will die first myself. What are you saying, my lord? From your voice, and from your position itself as hereditary priest, I know you are not old. The deacon shook his head. Bottolino then, to cheer him, tried to make him laugh by telling him his own and his friends' feats as students in Paris, but he realized that he was stirring in that man's heart furious desires, and rage at not being able to satisfy them. In so doing, Bottolino revealed himself for what he was and had been, forgetting that he was one of the Magi. But the deacon, too, no longer paid any attention to this, and made it clear that he had never believed in those 11 Magi, and had only recited the lesson prompted by the eunuchs. One day Bottolino, confronted by his obvious dejection in feeling himself excluded from the joys that youth grants all, tried to tell the deacon that one may also have a heart filled with love even for an unattainable beloved, and he told about his passion for a most noble lady and the letters he wrote her. The deacon questioned him in an excited voice, then burst into a moan like that of a wounded animal. Everything is forbidden me. Bottolino, even a love only dreamed of. If you only knew how I would like to ride at the head of an army, smelling the wind and the blood. 1,000 times better to die in battle murmuring the name of one's beloved than to stay in this cave awaiting. What? Perhaps nothing. But you, my lord, Bottolino said to him, you are destined to become the chief of a great empire. You, may God long preserve your father, will one day leave this cave, and Piendapetsum will be only the last and most remote of your provinces. One day I will do, one day I will be, the deacon murmured. Who can assure me of that? You see, Bottolino, my deep torment, God forgive me this gnawing suspicion, is that the kingdom may not exist. Who has told me of it? The eunuchs, ever since I was a child.
To whom do the messengers return that they, mind you, send to my father?
To them, to the eunuchs. Did these messengers really go forth? Did they really return? Have they ever really existed? All I know comes only from the eunuchs. And what if everything, this province, were the whole universe, if it were the fruit of a plot of the eunuchs, who make sport of me as if I were the lowest Nubian or Sciapod? What if not even the White Huns exist? Of all men a profound faith is required, if they are to believe in the Creator of heaven and earth and in the most unfathomable mysteries of our holy religion, even when they revolt our intellect. But the necessity to believe in this incomprehensible God is infinitely less demanding than what is asked of me, to believe only in the eunuchs. No, my lord, my friend, Bottolino consoled him, the kingdom of your father exists, because I have heard it spoken of not by the eunuchs but by people who believe in it. Faith makes things become true. My compatriots believed in a new city, one to inspire fear in a great emperor, and the city rose because they wanted to believe in it. The kingdom of the priest is real because I and my companions have devoted 2/3 of our life to seeking it. Who knows? The deacon said. But even if it does exist, I will not see it. Now that's enough. Buandulino said to him one day. You fear that the kingdom does not exist, and in waiting to see it, you decline in an endless boredom that will kill you. After all, you owe nothing to the eunuchs or to the priest. They chose you, you were an infant and could not choose them. Do you want a life of adventure and glory? Leave, mount one of our horses, go to the lands of Palestine, where valiant Christians are fighting the Moors. Become the hero you would like to be. The castles of the Holy Land are full of princesses who would give their life for one smile from you. Have you ever seen my smile? The deacon then asked. With one movement he tore the veil from his face, and to Buandulino there appeared a spectral mask, eroded lips revealing rotten gums and foul teeth. The skin of the face was wrinkled, and patches of it had contracted bearing the flesh, a repulsive pink. The eyes shone beneath bleary and gnawed lids. The brow was a single sore. He had long hair, and a wispy, forked beard covered what remained of his chin. The deacon removed his gloves, and scrawny hands appeared, marked by dark knots. This is leprosy, Buandulino. Leprosy, which spares neither kings nor the other powers of the earth. From the age of 20 I have borne this secret, of which my people are ignorant. I asked the eunuchs to send messages to my father, so he will know I will not live to succeed him, and so he may hasten to rear another heir. Let them even say I am dead, I would go to hide in some colony of my similars and no one would hear of me again.
But the eunuchs say that my father wants me to remain. And I don't believe it.
For the eunuchs a frail deacon is convenient. Perhaps I will die and they will go on keeping my embalmed body in this cavern, governing in the name of my corpse. Perhaps at the priest's death one of them will take my place, and no one will be able to say that it is not I, because no one has ever seen my face, and in the kingdom they saw me only when I was still sucking my mother's milk. This, Buandulino, is why I accept death by starvation, I who am steeped to my bones in death. I will never be a knight, I will never be a lover. Even you now, unaware, have stepped back 3 paces. And as you may have noticed, Praxias is always at a distance of at least 5 paces when he speaks to me. You see, the only ones who dare stand beside me are these 2 veiled eunuchs, young like me, stricken with the same disease, who can touch the objects I have touched, having nothing to lose. Let me cover myself again.
Perhaps you will not consider me unworthy of your compassion, if not of your friendship.
I sought words of consolation, Master Nikitas, but I was unable to find any. Then I said to him that perhaps, more than all the knights who rode to attack a city, he was the true hero, who lived out his fate in silence and dignity. He thanked me, and, for that day, he asked me to leave. But by now I had grown fond of that unhappy man. I began seeing him daily, I told him of my past reading, the discussions heard at court. I described the places I had seen, from Ratisbon to Paris, from Venice to Byzantium, and then Iconium and Armenia, and the peoples we had encountered on our journey. He was fated to die without having seen anything but the caves of Piendapetsim, so I tried to make him live through my tales. And I may also have invented. I spoke to him of cities I had never visited, of battles I had never fought, of princesses I had never possessed. I told him of the wonders of the lands where the sun dies. I made him enjoy the sunsets on the Propontis, the emerald glints on the Venetian lagoon, the valley in Hibernia where 7 white churches lie on the shores of a silent lake. I told him how the Alps are covered with a soft white substance that in summer dissolves into majestic cataracts and is dispersed in rivers and streams along slopes rich in chestnut trees. I told him of the salt deserts that extend along the coasts of Apulia. I made him shiver as I described seas I had never sailed, where fish leap as big as calves, so tame that men can ride them. I reported the voyages of St. Brendan to the Isles of the Blessed, and how one day, believing he had reached a land in the midst of the sea, he descended on the back of a whale, which is a fish the size of a mountain, capable of swallowing a whole ship, but I had to explain to him. I made him enjoy the sunsets on the Propontis, the emerald glints on the Venetian lagoon, the valley in Hibernia where 7 white churches lie on the shores of a silent lake. I told him how the Alps are covered with a soft white substance that in summer dissolves into majestic cataracts and is dispersed in rivers and streams along slopes rich in chestnut trees. I told him of the salt deserts that extend along the coasts of Apulia. I made him shiver as I described seas I had never sailed, where fish leap as big as calves, so tame that men can ride them. I reported the voyages of St. Brendan to the Isles of the Blessed, and how one day, believing he had reached a land in the midst of the sea, he descended on the back of a whale, which is a fish the size of a mountain, capable of swallowing a whole ship. But I had to explain to him what ships were: fish made of wood that cleave the waves, while moving white wings. I listed for him the wondrous animals of my country: the stag, who has two great horns in the form of a cross; the stork, who flies from one land to another, and takes care of its own parents when they are old, bearing them on its back through the skies; and the ladybug, which is like a small mushroom, red and dotted with milk-colored spots; the lizard, which is like a crocodile, but so small it can pass beneath the door; the cuckoo, who lays her eggs in the nests of other birds. Tick cataracts and is dispersed in rivers and streams along slopes rich in chestnut trees. I told him of the salt deserts that extend along the coasts of Apulia. I made him shiver as I described seas I had never sailed, where fish leap as big as calves, so tame that men can ride them. I reported the voyages of St.